Hello and welcome into episode 24 of Preps to Pros. And do we have a great show for you today? We're going to talk about two teams from the Sunflower State. Shout out Post Malone. They bet me, could I get a Post Malone reference in? I did it in less than 20 seconds of the show. But we got a great show for you today. We're going to talk a little bit of the juice. Georgia, big weekend coming up as they host a handful of top 247 prospects. We'll get into Kansas, their number 74 ranked recruiting class. And then we'll get into Kansas State as well in their top 40 recruiting class. We'll discuss everything Kansas and Kansas State football today. And then we'll get into our 2-minute drill. And that's it. But Drew, we love to get into a little Kansas football. Me and you have been talking about this for a while. When would we ever get an opportunity to do this? Kansas, under Lance Leipold, 5-0 right now. They're going to host College Game Day for the first time ever against number 17 TCU this weekend. How about things in the state of Kansas? Life is pretty good.
Yeah, why'd the Wildcats have to lose to Tulane, man? They'd be two undefeated teams. But no, I've been telling you, this is our lane, right? Let's get weird, get into the nitty-gritty, see if these teams are going to keep it going. So I'm fired up about this episode. I think this is our wheelhouse. This is our alley right here. So I'm ready to let it rip.
Let's get weird. Just a couple guys being dudes talking about Kansas and Kansas State football. So let's do it. But Drew, we're going to start with the juice. So people need their juice in a big weekend in Athens as the Bulldogs are taking on Auburn, a team that is struggling right now. But Georgia, handful of visitors this weekend. But I want to talk about the big one. That is top 247 defensive lineman Jordan Hall. He'll be in Athens this weekend. Where do the Bulldogs stand with the big man from Florida?
Yeah, this is one of the top uncommitted prospects really left on the board nationally. Jordan Hall, he's at Jacksonville Westside High School, big body in the middle right there. Georgia's a team I felt like has led throughout this recruitment. He hasn't named a leader. I don't have a crystal ball picking, but the fact that he's getting back to Athens this weekend on an unofficial says a lot to me. Now, there's some other schools involved in this recruitment. Jordan Hall is going to potentially, tentatively set to visit Alabama next weekend, and then he's going to get to Ohio State Thanksgiving weekend. So a few different schools in here, but I like Georgia right now with where this thing stands because of Trey Scott. Jordan Hall went up to Athens back in June, spent 4 days up there with Coach Scott and Kirby Smart. Came out of that visit really liking Athens, and I think, this says a lot. Again, Georgia, that he's going to be there. So we'll see how this recruitment shakes out. Miami, Florida State, those guys are also trying to hang on in that recruitment. LSU as well. But this is a big development for me because he's going to return at least one more time to UGA for that official visit, and I would assume it's probably going to be much closer to the early signing period.
Drew, been a lot of dialogue around Jordan Hall, the number 61 player in the top 247 and a top 10 defensive lineman. I think this guy can take another leap. And judging from what we've seen already in his senior season, a two-way player and a guy that is very active in the middle of his defense. I know me and you kind of talked about player comparisons, but he kind of reminded me of Jaheim Otis, the freshman of the week for Alabama this past week, and a guy that can make an impact early for Georgia. So that's the type of player, that's the caliber of player that we're talking about here in Jordan Hall. But Drew, going to be some other playmakers in Athens this weekend. Samuel M'Pemba going to be one of them, along with Damon Wilson as Georgia trying to find one of the best edge rushers in the country.
Yeah, we all last cycle we talked about that defensive line haul for Texas A&M, what they did in the class of 2022. We actually talked about it on the last show. Well, look at Georgia, what they could potentially do. They already have two top 247 defensive linemen committed in Gabe Harris and Jamal Jarrett. And then they got three guys on campus this weekend that I think they could also add to their class when, pen hits paper. You mentioned Samuel M'Pemba. He's another guy that has continued to return to Athens. He's probably going to, it's not a probably, he's definitely going to take an official visit to UGA. Last weekend, he was actually at Missouri visiting the Tigers, and he got a chance to see the Bulldogs play. So this is a guy that's very familiar with the program. The coaching staff has done an excellent job there. I think Georgia should be considered the favorite right now, the odds-on favorite to land his signature, and that'd be a huge win for the Bulldogs. The other guy is Damon Wilson, and Damon, he goes to school in Venice, Florida. That's an area that was hit super hard by Hurricane Ian. A lot of recovery efforts going on there. So he hasn't really been able to visit anywhere the past few weeks. Difficult to travel, but he's, again, someone that has been in Athens multiple times. He gets back this weekend. Ohio State's also involved in that recruitment. Alabama's involved in that recruitment. Cooper, I know you love some Damon Wilson. He's a potential riser for us in these rankings, a guy that was on my commit list. Let's say Georgia, they add those three on top of what they already have in Gabe Harris and Jamal Jarrett. I mean, how does this group stack up to what Texas A&M did last year on the defensive line?
Well, we didn't even talk about what Georgia brought in last year. 5-star Mykal Williams, along with 5-star Marvin Jones as well. And then there's Darius Smith, the 4-star, who's just kind of waiting in the weeds right now. So in terms of what Georgia is doing up front, obviously Texas A&M, Jimbo Fisher had an historical class last year that deserves a lot of credit. But Georgia is not that far off. And you talk about the combination of the guys that you mentioned earlier, a Samuel M'Pemba, a Damon Wilson. If they get one or two of those guys are game changers. And you know how highly we think of Damon Wilson, and Jordan Hall is certainly up front, a different type of player. And then you got Jamal Jarrett, who's being compared to Jordan Davis. So the rich get richer in this situation in Georgia, looking to close on some of the best defensive players in the country. And before we get to Kansas, like Andrew said, we're going to have a 2023 recruiting update to the top 247 next Wednesday, October 12th. So that's a good reminder to make sure that you tune in to the 247sports.com and the 247 Sports YouTube channel. Subscribe, like, comment, all that helps us. But Drew, now it is time, the state of Kansas. And like we said, we're very excited about this because it's very rare that people in our position get to take a peek under the hood and kind of see how these programs are building differently. At Kansas State, you have to do that. And credit to both of these coaches. They've gotten off to a pretty good start this season, and it's more of developmental programs. And we say that with all due respect. But let's get into Kansas right now. The number 74 ranked recruiting class for Lance Leipold, one of the hottest names in all of college football. Only 9 commitments. You look back at what they had last year, they were top 70 in recruiting, but they were top 25 in the transfer portal cycle. So you kind of see what Kansas is doing here. 15 players via the transfer portal last year. They want to make Kansas a priority. And Drew, even saying that, they don't have any player from the state of Kansas currently committed, but that's something that is certainly going to be in high esteem for them. But Drew, your first impressions of this class, only 9 guys committed, like I said earlier, but what are some of the things that kind of stand out to you?
Well, they got some good athletes committed. You look at those names right there, Shiraz Buncombe, Jared Sample. Those are both sub-11 guys in the 100-meter dash, guys that should play receiver. I know athlete is the tag for Shiraz right there, but they're pass catchers. And in Kansas, they're moving the ball at one of the highest clips in college football right now. And I think these two guys are going to allow the Jayhawks to continue to move the chains and get ahead of the chains and air it out. So I like that. You mentioned the fact that they don't have really anyone from the state of Kansas committed, but they are recruiting nationally. We see them in Florida right now. They're also out in California. So I think it's a smart tactic. You know, the state of Kansas isn't going to give you everything you need. So the fact that they've decided to go a little bit national and you know, what is Kansas's brand? Well, a lot of kids know Kansas because of Kansas basketball. I think it's a smart move. And I think this 5-0 season, is it going to help here in 2023? I don't know. We'll see how it plays out. I mean, most of the board's already in place, but in the class of 2024, most of these 16, 17, 18-year-olds, they're going to turn on the TV this upcoming Saturday to watch College Game Day. And where is it from? Lawrence, Kansas. So I think that's a huge that's going to allow them. I mean, you can send out recruiting graphics now with Game Day on there. So I like the fact that they're recruiting nationally, and I like the fact that they're going after athletes with traits.
2024 going to be a big year for Lance Leipold and the Kansas Jayhawks. And certainly this weekend, you've kind of already seen the benefit of that 5-0 start. A lot of top 247 talent coming to Lawrence, Kansas. Our director of recruiting, Steve Wiltfong, has detailed all of that and some of the guys that will be there this weekend. But Drew, I'm going to echo what you said. My first impressions on this class are the receiver room. You talk about 3 guys that offer something different. And when you talk about the receiver room, it's a lot like building a basketball team is what they say. You have to have guys that have different skill sets that are very versatile in what they can do. And they have that. They have a 6'4" receiver in Shiraz Buncombe, who is a sub-1100 meter guy. I think a very dynamic player when you watch him. Also, some of these guys as well that you'll see on there. Jared Sample, the speed guy, another guy, a sub 10.9 speed, straight line dynamic, can take the top off the defense. And a guy that they like a lot, Keaton Kubeka. From Austin Westlake, more of a possession guy, but a big physical style receiver that I think is going to be a go-to guy on those third down type of situations. So I like what Kansas is putting together. There's a lot of variety in that receiver room, and they should get a lot of credit there. So Kansas, in terms of the height, weight, speed philosophy, you can even build that there. And even though you got a recruiting class right now that ranks number 74, they've done a good job of that. So credit to Lance Leopold. But Drew, let's get into our headliners here at Kansas, and a guy that you're very familiar with from the state of Georgia. That's Kansas quarterback commit Kason Wiseman, and a guy that's got a fun game when you watch him, a little bit of freestyle to him. But what are your overall thoughts on him?
I think he can win games on Saturdays in the Big 12. I mean, you try to find a player comparison for him. It was hard, but Cooper, I'm going to toss this one out to you. I see a little Bo Nix in his game. I mean, in terms of the read option stuff, running around off-plane throws, I think, there's some Bo Nix in Kason Wiseman. And Kason's a kid that traveled around the country this summer. Actually, both of his parents work for Delta, so it's kind of easy for him to fly places. But he threw for a ton of different schools. He was looking for a spot, and Kansas ended up being the place for him. I like his ability to extend plays. I like how he's creative on the run, not having the best of senior seasons right now. But I think he's someone that you stash on the roster for 1, 2, 3 years, and then you let him rip. And I think the thing where he isn't afraid to take a shot is the best part of his game. Combine that with the running capability, and I think this is a great take for Kansas in the state of Georgia, which has turned out a ton of notable quarterbacks here in recent years.
I think he's fearless when you turn on the tape. I think the Bo Nix comparison is a great one. The NFL comp, I don't even really want to get into it because it might turn some Kansas fans off. But, I like the way he plays, and he kind of reminds me of Marcus Stokes, another quarterback that we have in our top 247, currently committed to the Florida Gators. But like I say, there's a lot of feel to his game. I think he needs to improve in terms of in the structure of the pocket. So I think there's a lot of upside there. But when you're at a place like Kansas, you got to dig these guys out, find what works in your system, and then tailor your offense around them. So a lot to work with Kason Wiseman. And I like this pickup for the Jayhawks. But Drew, another guy that both you and I mentioned already on this show, that is Jared Sample from the state of Texas. And like I said, speed. That's the first thing that comes up. But what do you like about this young man?
Well, Gabe Brooks, our guy there in Texas, has it on his profile. He's got, 6 sub-1100 meter dash times. You turn on the tape, he's this small, short guy, under 6 foot. You think he would be someone they're throwing screens to, slants, all that stuff, and it's not the case at all. He is a true deep ball threat. I think he averaged 33 yards per catch as a junior. This season as a senior, he's averaging 29 yards per catch. I mean, he just plays on the outside. He takes off, and he tracks the ball very well through the air. So I think he's someone that's going to go to Kansas, maybe transition to the inside, but he can run slots. He can run deep posts. He can take the top off of defense, and he makes safeties have to drop back into coverage. So I like him. I compared him to Quez Watkins, former Southern Miss wide receiver, now with the Philadelphia Eagles. Kind of the same thing with him on the shorter side, but he's not a chunk play guy. No, he's a true deep threat. So I really like this take. It's a nice find for Kansas down there in the state of Texas, and a guy that got on campus for a junior day, got him back for an official visit. So that's just good recruiting, good identification, and a nice pickup for Kansas.
That's how you do it right there, especially at a place like Kansas. You can't afford any ill-equipped missteps. Everything's got to be perfect in terms of the recruitment. They did that with Jared Sample. But Drew, I think you kind of nailed it there. This is a straight line, linear explosive. We talked about the track times, what this guy can do in terms of stretching a defense. My comparison for him, Philip Dorsett, originally drafted in the first round by the New England Patriots. And I'm not saying that Jared Sample's going to get drafted in the top 32. That may well be the case one day. But this is a guy that I think if you have a vision for him in his offense, and we talked about the variety that Kansas has recruited with at the receiver position, this is certainly a guy that can benefit and add a different dynamic to your offense. So a lot to like there with Jared Sample, another big playmaker who they have on the outside, that is Saraz Bunkum. They go all the way to California for this young man. And for me, Drew, the comparison, I'm reaching here, but it was kind of like a Terrace Marshall, kind of reminded me, Terrace Marshall Jr., who played his football, the 2019 national championship team at LSU, second-round pick of the Carolina Panthers, but smooth in and out of breaks, really knows how to utilize his frame. And what a luxury to have a guy that size that can run the way that he does. So I think a long wingspan, big catch radius, these are the type of guys that you win with, especially in the Big 12. We've seen this kind of blueprint. I think this is a great get for Kansas.
Yeah, Cooper, I compared him to former Stanford wide receiver Simi Fehoko, who's now with the Dallas Cowboys. I mean, Shiraz is kind of a bit of a stick man right now. He's going to need some time to add body armor, as I like to call it. He's going to need to get into a developmental weightlifting group. But when you turn on the tape, I mean, this is a guy that can run. He's all of 6'4". First track meet, he goes 10.8 in the 100-meter dash. And for people not familiar with track times, anything under sub-11 is considered elite for a high school senior. You're doing that in your first track meet when you're in starting blocks for the first time. That's pretty impressive. I also like the bloodlines with him. He had a grandfather won a national championship at USC a long time ago. His brother played at Stanford, got a degree from there. So smart kid, also won a state title this past season. I think it's a really good get for Kansas in a region where they don't really recruit. And I said that at the top of the show. I mean, Kansas going outside of the state borders, I think that's the home base. But they're also looking for talent elsewhere, and that's a smart strategy for Lance Leopold and that staff.
All right, Drew, now that we're done with the headliners, our favorite part of the segment, the more love segment, some of the guys that don't get as talked about in the recruiting process as much, or maybe aren't stealing as much as the headlines. And I could have guessed it, but one of the only guys from Florida in this class for Kansas, that looks like the direction you're going with. But I like this guy, big boy, Marcus Calvin. Tell me what you like about him, Drew.
Well, have you seen him play basketball? I mean, he has some of the best basketball highlights for anyone that's pushing 300 pounds. And I think he would have played hoops long term if he didn't plateau at 6 foot. I mean, he's about 6 foot, pushing 6'1". This is an explosive interior lineman. I think he's the ideal 3 or 1 technique that can create some push. I also think he could be a power 5 offensive lineman. There's some clips out there of him playing guard. He gets to the second level extremely well. So I love this take. Jim Paganos, he's a first-year defensive line coach for Kansas. He has a ton of experience recruiting the Sunshine State, more specifically so that Tampa region and St. Petersburg, which is where Marcus Calvin is from. I mean, Vanderbilt wanted this kid. That's an SEC program. So I think that's a really, really good take for Kansas. And I wouldn't be surprised if he's a multi-year impact player, assuming there's no setbacks.
I like that kid a lot, man. He's the dancing bear. That would have been the nickname given to him. Big guys that can move like that, ballerina feet. That's a really good get for the Jayhawks. I'm going to go all the way out to Colorado now, from Florida to Colorado, Kansas, right in between. But this Logan Brantley kid, linebacker out of Cherry Creek High School in Colorado. And Cherry Creek is the home to Blake Purchase, top 247 edge linebacker. And when you turn on the tape, Logan Brantley is really hard to miss. This is a guy who makes plays sideline to sidelines. You can play him off the edge standing up. He's got some pass rushing ability, but he plays with his hair on fire. So I love his competitive temperament. He's in the mix. I think his key and diagnose ability is kind of what makes him special. A guy that's very instinctive in the box and can play sideline to sideline. So we talk a lot on this show, Drew, about the speed and space and how the game is changing, and you need linebackers that can track sideline to sideline. Looks like Kansas has one of those guys. So you talk about going all the way down to Florida to get a defensive lineman like Marcus Calvin, and then going to Colorado to get a guy like Logan Brantley. It's impressive what Lance Leopold and his staff have been able to do, kind of peppering Kansas, the surrounding states in the Southwest, and then being able to go national to kind of fit needs. So very good job there by Kansas. Now, Drew, we're going to get into the segment now. The biggest question mark you have looking at this class, and we're nitpicking here, self-admittedly, but if there's one thing that kind of raises your eyebrows a little bit when you're looking at this recruiting class, what is it?
So I'm going to go in a little different direction here. I just want to know, how does Kansas finish? And last year, you mentioned how active they were in the transfer portal. They took 15 kids, and 2 of those kids are going to start on Saturday against TCU on the defensive front. So I'm interested to see, how does Kansas decide to use their counters? You can only bring in so many kids a cycle, and right now you're one of the hottest, biggest names in all of college football. I mean, you are going to have some doors that are open that you probably didn't think were going to be open before. So how do they close this things out? And then more importantly, are they able to parlay the on-field success here in 2022 into that class of 2024? Because that's where I think they could get the real bump on the recruiting trail. I think the other thing, Lance Leopold, he's got to keep selling the same message, and that he is, fully committed to Kansas football right now. His name has been linked to every Power 5 opening, Wisconsin, Nebraska, everyone. And if there's more openings, he's going to be a pretty hot name. So he needs to keep selling the focus that, I'm locked in, because the negative recruiting will eventually happen if Kansas finds themselves in some of these recruiting battles. So, just maintaining course, I think, is the biggest question. Are they able to do that over the next few months?
If he stays locked in, and these are 2 jobs that I think are they fit Lance Leopold. But Drew, you and I talked about this on Monday. I would love to see Lance Leopold stay and continue to build what he has built at Kansas. I think the administration right there working on trying to build a new stadium. So positive steps being taken right now at Kansas. And Drew, mine's a little bit more nuanced, more football, but right now 0 offensive line commits for Kansas in the Jayhawks. That is something that I think is typical when you're looking at how many guys they should take a year. Usually that number is around 3, 4, typically if you have one guy going out, but only one senior starter on Kansas is offensive line right now. But Kansas getting it done, man. And for us, Drew, I think we are in agreement here, but the last wish for Kansas right now, if they're running the table, they're 5-0. Recruiting momentum is great. They have College Game Day coming to Lawrence for the first time ever. Things are really good in Lawrence, Kansas right now. But if there was one addition that can make this better, who would it be?
Jamarion Wilcox, running back out of the state of Georgia. He actually lives with Kason Wiseman, the quarterback commit. This is a kid that's already ran for over 1,000 yards in 5 games. And talking to Michael Swain, who covers Kansas for the 24/7 Sports Network, he said that Kansas is shooting their shot with this kid. He was in town last weekend on an unofficial visit for the win over Iowa State. He's getting a lot of interest from the SEC. He's got an official visit set up to Kentucky. Clemson's kicked the tires. Georgia's in contact. We'll see if Kansas can get an official visit. But, man, if they're able to add him, he's a legitimate playmaker, a guy that I think will potentially or should eventually move up in our rankings. So, this is someone where Kansas maybe 2-3 months ago, they don't have any chance, but now you're 5-0, game days in town, and this is someone you look to shoot your shot with, like Swain said. So we'll see what happens there.
I don't think they've made any secret about their want for Jamarion Wilcox. Talking to some people around Kansas, Drew, I'm going to have to go with you. I think that's the one guy on their board they have circled right now. You talked about the relationship that he has with the quarterback commit, Kason Wiseman. I think this is a big potential addition for Kansas and would be the cherry on top to what they're building already. And you talk to people around Kansas, and that was kind of my question. Are we going to see a similar blueprint to what we saw in the first season under Lance Leopold? This is a team that took 15 transfers. I mentioned that in the earlier in the show. But this is a very prideful group when it comes to the state of Kansas. And I mentioned that they want to continue to make the state of Kansas a priority. Only one player from the state last year in Kansas's 2022 recruiting class. Right now, 0. So you can bet that they want to change that. That is not a theme that they want to stick with. But Drew, final thoughts on Kansas as we wrap here before we go to Kansas State.
I think if Lance stays in place, I mean, they have the right formula. We talked about, getting guys from different parts of the country, and all those guys have different traits. I mean, Marcus Calvin's a 300-pounder playing basketball. We talked about the track times with the wide receivers. I think they have the right quarterback, so they win. It's like if you build it, they'll come. I think if you win, these kids are going to come, and they're already finding the kids before they had 5 wins in game day on campus. So I think the arrow is certainly pointing up, and there's a lot to like about this group, even though it's just 9 guys. And I know it's ranked 74th right now. They're going to add some transfers, and it's going to move up. That's just the reality kind of when you look at counters.
Yeah, you talk to people around Kansas, kind of the theme there is competitive depth when they talk about roster building and alignment in terms of their culture. All their guys are bought in. Obviously, Lance Leopold, known for that track record, a keeper of the culture. And then Jalen Daniels, the quarterback right now, is getting a little bit of Heisman buzz, but he's a straw that stirs the drink and kind of elevates everybody else. So Kansas right now, 5-0. Life is good if you're a Jayhawks fan. So we're going to take a quick breath here, Drew. And now we're going to go to Kansas State and the Wildcats, who right now have the number 39 ranked recruiting class. They beat Oklahoma, but they also lost to Tulane earlier this year. Overall, they're 4-1. I think you got to be pretty happy where you're at if you're a Kansas State fan. But we are here to talk about recruiting. And Drew, I want to get your first impressions on this Kansas State class.
It's ranked 39th, but I love it. I think they got the guys that can come in where they can run what they're doing right now. They have a potential Deuce Vaughn and Joe Jackson, a running back commit we're going to get into here in a little bit. They have another Adrian Martinez and Avery Johnson, the quarterback commit. I like this group. 18 commits. They're from all over the country. We talked about national recruiting with Kansas. Kansas State's doing the same thing. I think there's some really good recruiters on that staff. Thad Ward, former UCF player who's now there in Manhattan. He's got ties to the Sunshine State. He's allowing Kansas State to kind of get involved there. So really, really talented group. It might not reflect it in the rankings, the composite rankings, but Cooper, I know you are a big fan of Avery Johnson, and I think you would agree with me that this is a really, really talented group, and there's not a lot of head-scratching takes.
18 commitments, 12 different states, pretty similar to Kansas and what we talked about. Obviously, Kansas is going to be a priority, but you look at Kansas State, 6 commitments from the state of Kansas, where right now Kansas is shut out. So they've done a really good job there. To me, Drew, when you look at this class, from top to bottom, they're football players. At a place like Kansas State, you are going to have to identify, evaluate, and develop your talent. And that is exactly what Kansas State has done. That is exactly what they're doing in this recruiting class. You look at all their guys, football intelligence and toughness is at the top of their list when they're seeking out what a Kansas State Wildcat is, and they have built that through this class. I think guys that have multi-sport backgrounds, guys that are multi-positional, and guys that can play 2 ways or 3 phases. I love what Kansas State is doing there. Yeah, there's going to be a couple guys in your class, most of them, they're going to be missing that one trait, whether it's size, speed, whatever it is. But you have to find the guys that are high floor players, are going to buy into your culture and going to be a good predictor of success. And Kansas State has had that recipe. Coach Kleiman has had that recipe for quite some time, and they have gone out and they have executed that vision. So I love the fact, and trust me, I am a sucker for head coaches and for programs who know who they are, and they don't try to go outside of that. So Chris Kleiman, a guy that has certainly built that culture from the ground up, and they know exactly who they are, and they're not going to really kind of stride too far away from that. So big fan. Now let's get into it. Let's get into the headliners. And Drew, you brought it up. My favorite guy, and a guy we just turned on the senior tape, and I think both me and you were like, whoa, where'd that come from? That is Avery Johnson, top 247 quarterback, a guy that has a dynamic basketball background, led his team in scoring the past few years at Mays High School in Kansas. But this was a absolute must-get for Kansas State. They had to fend off Notre Dame, Oregon, Washington, and a handful of others. Drew, as we've seen him progress throughout his career, and I know me and you had a long conversation about this last night, but just your thoughts on what Avery Johnson could mean to this program.
He's one of the best athletes in the country. I mean, he was number 13 on my freaks list, and he's improved as a passer here significantly as a senior. Cooper, I know you're going to get into that, but let's just talk about the athletic profile. You mentioned basketball. How about his testing numbers? 4.5 in the 40-yard dash. He has done that at least 3 different times. 36.7-inch vertical jump, 4.2 in the short shuttle. This guy's a better spark score than Jalen Hurts and Lamar Jackson did coming out of high school. So I think his ability to run the football, we know Kansas State likes to do that under Adrian Martinez, a top 10 rushing offense nationally right now. I think this kid, he's electric with the ball in his hands. And if you're looking for a player comp, I really struggled. I think frame-wise, and I can say this because I saw Lamar Jackson when he was in high school, I think the frame is very similar. I also think he kind of throws the ball and releases it somewhat similar to Lamar Jackson. He can make some really wow throws. And I'm not saying he's Lamar, but he has that playmaking type of capability. I love Avery Johnson. I think they're going to have to maybe fight to hold on to him. I was going through some Kansas State message boards and rumors about him potentially visiting FSU and all that stuff. But I think this kid should stay home because he's going to have a ton of success there under the new offensive coordinator, Colin Klein, who is a K-State legend himself. So I like him a lot. Cooper, tell us about that passing, because I know you were firing the text. He's 67% as a passer. I actually think it's better than that, 72%, right?
72%. This is a guy who's averaging over 250 yards per game through the first 5 games of the season, 14 touchdowns, 1 interception. He is taking care of the football. And people might say, okay, what's the big revelation with this? A year ago, we were having conversations whether or not Avery Johnson was going to be a quarterback. And then I got to see him at the Elite 11 regionals in Nashville. And that was a guy who went home and walked home with a little bit of confidence from that day, got invited to the Elite 11 finals. And listen, this guy has been through a lot of adversity in his life, was paralyzed at one point. Then you mentioned the multi-sport background. His development as a passer has really kind of put him in a different category. He is the best athlete at the position in this cycle, in my opinion, especially in the top 247. That's really not even debatable. So you see the way that this guy moves with the football. To me, it's the fact that has become not even an adequate passer, but an above average passer as well. And you talked about completing at a 72% clip. This guy is so dynamic with what he can do. And what's important is because the next guy that we're going to talk about, the combination of Avery Johnson and the potential running back coming in at Kansas State, the dynamic duo there in the upside. And we just talked about the effect and the impact Jalen Daniels has had at Kansas. Avery Johnson, to me, is a top 64 player in the country, and I think is a guy that can completely change this program. And on top of that, he's made of the right stuff. So I think he's got the it factor. I think he's got some juice to him. And I think Kansas State, like I said, they've done a really good job making sure they've done everything in the process to nail him down and make sure that he is not looking elsewhere. That time is going to come if it's not already here. Bigger programs are going to come in and start knocking on Avery Johnson's door. Priority number one for Kansas State's got to be able to keep him in the boat. But Drew, the running mate here for Avery Johnson is a guy that you brought up a couple weeks ago because you loved him so much in the 2-minute drill. That's Joe Jackson, a guy out of the state of Florida that you think can run wild with Avery Johnson once they get to the Little Apple there in Manhattan.
Yeah, Kansas State had a bit of a blow a few months ago when they lost Dylan Edwards, one of the fastest recruits in the country, an in-state player. He flipped over to Notre Dame. And yeah, there's no question that's a big sting. But I think Joe Jackson is a nice, plan B or plan A, C or whatever you want to call him. This is a guy that set a school record carrying the ball 22 times for 362 yards and 6 touchdowns in a game. And he's not doing this against nobody. I mean, this is Sunshine State competition. He's a 4.5 kid on the lasers. He can also catch the ball out of the backfield and out of the slot. I've compared him to Demetric Felton, former UCLA running back / slot receiver who's done both at the next level. I mean, he's just a playmaker to me, someone that you're going to have in that backfield next to Avery Johnson. And you can get creative with him. So I think it's a great take. I think he's absolutely locked in with the Wildcats. I saw him a few weeks ago at a different game. He was out there just watching. He was wearing the K-State gear. So a nice find for Kansas State in an area that's kind of under-recruited a little bit, that Polk County. You have to have some connections. And I mentioned it, Thad Ward, the new assistant there who has ties to the Sunshine State. He's a big reason why Joe Jackson's headed to Manhattan. I think it's a great find for them, and he should be able to make plays on Saturdays.
Patience, vision, suddenness, kind of a guy we were talking about a little bit earlier, not as far as physique, But as far as play style, kind of reminded me of Quinshon Judkins, a guy that came out of Alabama and one of the leading rushers for all freshmen in college football this year at Ole Miss. I like a lot about what Joe Jackson can do. And you talk about the benefit of having a good running game. That's going to take a lot of pressure off a guy like Avery Johnson. So you think about that dynamic duo right there, the quarterback and the running back for Kansas State for years to come. If they can keep Avery Johnson in the fold, and the same with Joe Jackson, because I believe there's probably going to be some more potential suitors out there for him as well. Kansas State could have a lethal rushing attack in the future. But, Drew, let's get into the passing game now. The third guy here, that is Andre Davis, whose dad played in the NFL for 8 years. And this is a big target, 6'4", 190 pounds, a guy with a big frame. What do you like about him?
Well, we don't have verified measurements on him, but you turn on the tape and he does look to be 6'4", 200 pounds. I can, as soon as I put on the film, I said this guy reminds me of Lawrence Cager, former Miami wide receiver who ended up at Georgia, now with the New York Jets, and he's kind of transitioned into a flex tight end role. I think you could see the same thing with Andre Davis. I mean, he just has long limbs. You throw it in his direction, there's a good chance he's going to come down with it. Love the bloodline. Dad not only played in the league for 8 years, he caught over 300 passes before he ended up becoming a scout with the Kansas City Chiefs. So this is a good find. We talk about Kansas, with some recruiting wins. How about this recruiting win for Kansas State? Andre was scheduled to take an official visit to Iowa. He ends up canceling that and then commits on the spot to the Wildcats. So I like this find. A big guy you can play on the outside. I'm assuming he's eventually going to be able to block well once he's coached up. But, man, you have that trio of Avery Johnson, Joe Jackson, and then Andre Davis on the outside. That's what you're looking for in an offense.
Anytime you get the bloodlines involved, that's when Andrew Ivins' eyebrows are going to perk up a little bit. He's a big bloodlines guy. But listen, Drew, I like this kid a lot. Big, kind of like basketball background, 50-50 pass catcher. I think is going to be a guy that's really going to excel in the red zone, and a guy that you could rely on in third down. He's a big, dependable target. He can make himself big. Talked about the catch radius as well earlier with Buncombe at Kansas. I think this is kind of a similar type of situation. So Kansas State, we've talked a lot about the quarterback. We've talked a lot about the running game. Now, on the perimeter, what's that going to look like? Certainly you're going to get some size out there as well with Andre Davis. So Kansas State sitting in a pretty good position right now. You got to be pretty excited if you're a Wildcats fan with the type of talent they have coming in at the skill position. But Drew, now back to the more love. We love the more love. And you had this guy circled, and I kind of went back and forth. I like this guy too, but a defensive back for Kansas State on his way in. That is Wesley Fair. What do you like about him?
In-state kid, and he actually plays quarterback for his high school team. And I wanted to get some defensive flavor out here. I mean, this is a guy, I was watching his huddle, came across a basketball highlight. He blocks the shot, picks up that block shot, runs down the court on a breakaway and slams down a dunk. To me, he's just a really natural athlete, very good in space. You're seeing it here. And that translates over to the defensive side of the ball. You got to remember, he's been reading defenses. Now he's going to flip it over to the other side. He's going to be reading offenses, and he's got good instincts. So I think this is a nice find for them in state, and someone I expect to work his way into that two deep and eventually be a starter, but probably not talked about enough. I do know Alan True, our colleague up there in the Midwest, he actually compared Wesley to Jordan Poyer of the Buffalo Bills. So, maybe someone that could potentially rise in the rankings. We'll see. But I think he's a nice get for Kansas State.
That's a hell of a comp right there. Jordan Poyer can play some ball. But I'm going to go with another guy from the state of Idaho, Rocky Mountain High, Idaho. That is Jackson Fulmer, and a guy 6'5", 270 pounds right now, has some versatility, plays on the left side, starts as a left tackle for his high school. But when you look at him, the frame obviously stands out, but the athleticism, quiet feet, really patient at the line of scrimmage, understands leverage. I think this is going to be a guy that once he gets in Kansas State's program, he's going to have to add some weight to his frame, but you could see him at the right tackle spot, potentially maybe move inside. But this is a really good football player and a guy that stood out to me. And when you look at guys like this in the state of Idaho and the exposure that they have, it benefits them to go to places like Kansas State where they can sit, wait, be coached, and be developed. So I like Jackson Fulmer a lot. There are a lot of other candidates here, Drew, and I know you agree with me. Cameron Salas, the safety out of the state of Texas really liked him. Instinctive, a guy that can play in run support and seems to be very comfortable closer to the line of scrimmage. R.J. Lester, big physical corner from Arkansas, and Ryan Davis as well, another edge guy. So Kansas State, no shortage of guys that kind of fit them. We talked about football instincts and intelligence kind of be at the front of mind when you're recruiting a Kansas State football player. They have seemed to do that top to bottom. But Drew, just like we did with Kansas, kind of the one thing maybe in this class that kind of draws back a little hesitation when you're looking at this class.
I think it's, can they hang on to Avery Johnson? I think he's such an integral part of this group. You mentioned he's got the it factor. I think when you get a quarterback like this and one that's in your backyard, he becomes the face of your recruiting class. You know, when kids come on visits, he's there, he's talking to those other guys. He's texting them. So I think keeping him in the boat will be the biggest thing. And it sounds like by all accounts that will be the case, but you never know who's going to come knocking. There's a lot of big programs out there, Power 5 programs that are looking for a quarterback. You know, Wisconsin doesn't have one committed. Who you would assume whoever's hired there is going to go find an arm. Florida State's still looking for a 2023 quarterback. Notre Dame's still looking for a quarterback. So I think the biggest thing is keeping him on board because it's going to make everything else that much easier for the Wildcats.
Well, let me tie this back into Avery Johnson one more time because that seems to be the theme of our show. We talked about the backfield. We talked about Andre Davis already. And trust me, it seems like Kansas State is going to put Avery Johnson in the best position to be successful. But on the perimeter, you want to make sure you got some speed right now. Obviously, they got some size. They have some big targets. We mentioned Andre Davis. But I think it's going to be imperative. I think one of the best parts of Avery Johnson's game is being able to throw the deep ball and throw it accurately. So you talk about the impact that he can have on opposing defenses with his legs sucking up the second and third level. I think there are going to be a lot of opportunities in the deep third of the field for Kansas State to take advantage of. So right now, that's one area of improvement where I think they can get better. But Drew, before we wrap up on Kansas State, your final thoughts on this class?
It's a solid group, and let's go back to the 18 commits. 12 of them from different states. You go 5-1 or 4-1 or whatever they're going to finish. You're competitive in the Big 12. More people are going to be seeing you, and I think that's going to allow Kansas State to continue to recruit Florida, continue to recruit Texas, continue to get out there. So that's what I like about this group. It's just coming from all different parts of the country, and Chris Kleiman deserves a ton of credit for that.
All right, Drew, real quick, don't want to leave this out, but if there was one player right now on Kansas State wish list, who would it be to finish out this cycle?
Joshua Manning, 4-star wide receiver, lives 2 hours away from Manhattan, currently committed to Missouri. Well, remember, Kansas State beat Missouri there in week 2, and they beat them in convincing fashion. This is a guy that Avery Johnson, you go through Avery Johnson's social media feeds, he's been working Josh Manning. So I think if you are Kansas State, you just keep sending those early text messages, keep sending him the mail, and just see how this thing plays out. Who knows what's going to happen at Missouri? Obviously, they had a great effort last week against Georgia, but Eli Drinkwitz, I mean, they're in the SEC. That's a very competitive conference. So I think he's the one. And Cooper, I mean, that ties into exactly what you said, speed out on the perimeter. This is a guy that can do it all, play multiple positions. So he would be the big win for them.
Kansas State also in the mix for John Randall Jr., in-state player, another dynamic running back. You talk about pairing him with Joe Jackson. You can't have enough of these guys. So for Kansas State to be able to have a guy like Randall, who's got a very decorated track and field background, big, explosive back, that kind of gives you a nice little 1-2 punch there. No shortage of options for Kansas State. And if you talk about throwing in a guy like Josh Manning and John Randall Jr., then you got something cooking there for Colin Klein, the offensive coordinator at Kansas State. So, Drew, that does it for Kansas and Kansas State. That was fun, my man. I enjoyed that. To me, like, our show always runs over when we do these team breakdowns, but to me, that's the most enjoyable part of what we do. I love getting in the weeds of this stuff.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see. I mean, we highlight names that people probably never have heard of. Do they end up signing with these schools? And we're not doing that as a disrespect to Kansas or Kansas State, but I think there's some names that other schools will take a good hard look at as they try to put the final pieces on their class here over the next 2.5 months.
We got the receipts, baby. And if you're looking for the receipts, they're on the 24/7 Sports YouTube channel. Just another reminder there. Make sure you like the show, leave a comment, especially if you like the content. But Drew, it's time for the 2-minute drill. And this was kind of interesting. You brought this up to me maybe a day or two ago. Our friend at CBS Sports, Danny Cannell, maybe brought this up. I don't know how much backing it has, but this is maybe something to keep an eye on, Tyler Van Dyke and his status at Miami.
Yeah, well, Cannell said that he thought, this on the Ryan Russillo podcast, that Tyler Van Dyke is some guy that could potentially enter the transfer portal if things don't work out this season in Coral Gables. Remember, Tyler Van Dyke, he was everyone thought he was a first-round draft pick, potential Heisman Trophy candidate, but he has struggled this season at Miami, just 4 of 11 on deep shots. I think the big issue, to be honest, is the wide receivers. Cooper, how crazy is this? Miami, right now, on their roster, they do not have a wide receiver that has a 100-yard game against a Power 5 opponent, to their credit. I went through all the bios. None of them do. So I think that's a big issue. Miami's dealing with a ton of injuries. And I think the storyline on Saturday, when they square off with North Carolina, coming off that bye week, how long of a leash does Tyler Van Dyke have, right? We saw Mario Cristobal insert Jake Garcia into the game against Middle Tennessee when they were trailing. Garcia had some success. Well, Mario comes out and says that, no, Tyler Van Dyke is our guy. I talked to a few different contacts. They echoed that same thing. TBD is still the quarterback. But what happens if North Carolina races out to a 14-0 lead? Do they start, changing quarterbacks, playing the hot hand? I think you can potentially lose a locker room when you do that. I don't have a good feel on what the team wants. But with Manny Diaz, that seemed to be one of the big issues that sunk him, quarterback play. Obviously, you got De'Aaron King there at the end, but remember, it was Jaron Williams, it was N'Kosi Perry, Tate Martell. And then when you look at Miami's recruiting class, he's got 2 quarterbacks committed, Jaden Rashada and Emory Williams. I think a lot of eyes are going to be on that quarterback situation. How does Mario Cristobal manage this? As much as I like Tyler Van Dyke, I think he's the answer. He struggled last year against the Tar Heels, 20 of 45 passing, tossed 3 interceptions. So this isn't exactly a game that I would label as an easy get-back game for Tyler Van Dyke. So I'll be watching Saturday. What happens with that quarterback situation?
This isn't anything new with the Mario Cristobal led team or offense, and before you're talking about Josh Gaddis, one of the hottest names this offseason, in Mario making a splash, bringing him down to Coral Gables. And there's been a lot of issues there. But before that, it was Joe Moorhead at Oregon. And before that, it was Marcus Arroyo. Now, both those guys are head coaches, and Arroyo's off to a 4-1 start this season at UNLV. And at the quarterback position, you had Justin Herbert, who is obviously a very rare prospect and one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL. That was up to some debate at Oregon, if you remember anything about Justin Herbert's time in Eugene. So you start looking at this situation. Well, what's the common denominator? That's the head coach. Now, I'm not aware of anything that's going on behind the scenes, but before you start throwing rocks at your quarterback, who you said was the best quarterback in the country when you got hired, maybe take a look in the mirror. So I think Mario Cristobal, Josh Gaddis, they need to get on the same page, and they need to figure out how to put Tyler Van Dyke in the best situation to be successful, because to me, that guy's got all the talent. This is a guy that we're talking about as a potential top 32 pick in the NFL draft this upcoming year, and now all of a sudden he's not going to play against North Carolina. So to me, if you're looking at this as a Miami fan, these are some issues that need to get fixed here pretty soon. And if I'm Jaden Rashada, if I'm Emory Williams, yeah, you better believe I'm looking at this and how this plays out over the rest of the season. So as good as things have been for Miami this offseason, they need to get it figured out on the field. Talent acquisition is never going to be a problem for Mario Cristobal. X's and O's, execution, preparation, those seem to be a big question. So Miami's got to get that fixed. I'm with you, Andrew, 100% on this. And this is definitely something that I think we got to watch going forward. I kind of brought it up this offseason, but this staff that Mario Cristobal brought in was a staff that was lauded, and it should be. It's an experienced staff. It has some innovation in there with a guy like Josh Gaddis. But Kevin Steele on the other side was a guy that tried to get the Auburn job. That was very well documented about the way that he went about that. Charlie Strong used to be the head coach at Texas. So you have guys that have been in big positions before. To me, can you manage those people in the building? That's a big question. And are we seeing that playing out on the field right now, or are these guys just not prepared? Because Miami has enough talent to play better than they did against Middle Tennessee State, and they should have played better against Texas A&M, quite frankly. So my 2 cents. Sorry, a little bit of a rant there on Miami, but Drew, I'm gonna switch here. I'm gonna go ahead. You got to finish. You got something you got to say?
I loved it. The only thing I'm going to push back on is I don't know if they have the talent at wide receiver. That's been a theme on this show. That's been a theme all season. I think Tyler Van Dyke's he's got one hand tied behind his back. I mean, he doesn't have the go-to receiver like he did last season, and I think people need to realize that. So that's my only pushback on the Miami talent thing.
Completely fair and valid point. I think the point I was trying to make, in the future, talent acquisition is not really going to be an issue with this team. They're certainly going to be talented. But, I had a coach and a guy and a Hall of Famer always used to say, hey, don't spoil our talent. That just means put these guys in the best position to win. Are you doing that every Saturday? Seems to be a question right now in Miami. But Drew, I'm going to go to Baton Rouge. Big game shaping up this weekend between top 25 LSU and a top 10 team in Tennessee, with the number 1 offense in the country and a top 5 scoring offense as well. And you look at LSU after the loss to Florida State, the week 1, it was kind of perceptually, I wouldn't say demoralizing. Maybe that's a little bit dramatic, but I think a lot of people kind of wrote LSU off as a rebuilding year, and it is a rebuilding year. I think you would be wise to say that. But right now, LSU 2-0 in SEC play, beat a very good Mississippi State team who just beat Jimbo Fisher, and they handled them in that game against the Aggies. So Matt House, defensive coordinator, comes over from the Kansas City Chiefs. I think he's got these guys playing well. And the other thing about LSU, those were both games where they trailed Mississippi State and Auburn by double digits. Auburn on the road, the latest game, and they come back and they did not blink. So I like LSU. I love the experience that they're getting right now. You're talking about starting 2 tackles, and although talented freshman tackles, Will Campbell, Emory Jones getting a lot of run. The transfer Miles Frazier from FIU. They've kind of lacked continuity at times on the offensive line throughout the season. I think Jaden Daniels needs to be a little bit more aggressive in the passing game. They have to find a way to unlock Keyshawn Butte and the rest of these receivers. But LSU right now, there's a lot of fuss being made. Is this game going to be at 2:30? Is it going to be a night game? It's an 11 o'clock game. This game is sold out. I think fans are going to be excited for this one. I'll be back home in Baton Rouge this weekend. You got some recruiting implications on the line too, Drew, because one of those receivers, a needy position for him, Jalen Brown, committed to the Tigers right now. But you had mentioned the last couple of weeks, Texas A&M, Florida State, Miami, all knocking on his door, and Tassili Akana as well, the top 247 pass rusher and a top 40 player, will be in Baton Rouge this weekend. So Brian Kelly looking to make his move on the recruiting trail. And if LSU comes out the other side with a dub, maybe you're kind of adjusting expectations in 2022. But in terms of what their future looks like, these are kind of program foundational wins. And if you're looking at that through the lens of 2022, you'd be wrong. But in the future, to have such a young team being able to get this type of experience, go on the road, face adversity, overcome, and win those type of games, it doesn't matter if it's ugly. Just find a way to win. You want to create winning habits and good habits. I think LSU's doing that right now. And Drew, I got to say, I'm excited about the promise surrounding that program. I think good things are in store for LSU. But Drew, that about wraps it up, man. Great show. Enjoyed it. Kansas State, Sunflower State. Shout out to Post Malone one more time. All delivering. Your final thoughts on today's show before we go here.
I'm excited to see what other teams of the week we get in the future. How weird can we get? Now, maybe Duke potentially. You know, they're slipping along. We went heavy on Duke a while back. No, it was fun. Again, I think this is our lane, just kind of getting into the nitty gritty on some of those classes. Kansas State, both recruiting very well. Obviously having success here on the field in 2022.
Big Duke guy right there, Andrew Ivins. Anytime he can talk about Duke and Mike Elko, he's going to throw that in there. But, guys, we appreciate you joining us. We will be back next week, Monday, 3 o'clock Eastern. A lot to talk about. Like I said, 2023 Top 247 is going to get an update and a facelift next week. That's going to be out on Wednesday. So the board's going to change a little bit. That happens when you play a senior season. Things change. But for Andrew Ivins, I am Cooper Petagna, and we will see you next week.